And it's so lovely to see you all. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Good afternoon. It's a very warm welcome from me and from our expert panel this afternoon. My name is Sally Rasmussen. I'm from Fearless Marketing, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's webinar on behalf of the Health and Social Care team, Gordon's Partnership Solicitors. The team at Gordon's, led by Neil Grant, have many years of wide-ranging experience supporting providers of health and social care services up and down the country, as well as acting for regulatory bodies. Today's webinar is focused on a crucial topic for care providers: navigating the business risks associated with the simple framework. This promises to be an essential information gathering opportunity for care professionals seeking to enhance their understanding of the management of these regulatory challenges. So before we kick off, let me introduce our panel. From Gordon's Partnership, we have Neil Grant, partner, and Samantha Burgess, senior associate solicitor. Alongside them are two experts from the care sector: Tim Dallinger, founder of Social Care Consultants Limited, and Charlie Jones, Chief Operating Officer at BKR Care Consultancy. Their collective expertise and first-hand experiences will undoubtedly offer invaluable insights today into the intricacies of compliance and operational excellence in the framework of the CQC assessment. We plan to cover a number of areas, including preparing for assessment under CQC's assessment framework, what to expect from the CQC inspection, and how and when to challenge CQC appropriately. I'll be doing my best to keep the panel to time and on topic so we can cover the areas as promised. If you have any questions, please pop those into the chat, the chat section below. And if you see a question in the chat that you would really like answered, if you could then please give it a thumbs up, and then with the most votes will rise to the top, and the panel can then answer the questions that are most important to you, our audience. I'm now going to hand over to Neil, and he's going to give a brief summary of the standard assessment framework before we begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally, for the introduction. Can you hear me okay? Is it clear to the participants? That's great. Yeah. Obviously delighted to be delivering this seminar today to such a large number of care providers and people with an interest in the sector. Just to start with, in terms of the single assessment framework, I'd like to really sort of just refer to CQC's own assessment handbook, which we got hold of under Freedom of Information. And CQC says that its purpose and role as a regulator has not changed. And in actual fact, as a lawyer, I can actually say the law is really the same as well. So what are we looking at? What is actually significant here? Well, it's how CQC works and carries out its assessments. That is changing. They're adopting a more structured approach to how they gather evidence. There's a scoring framework that they're introducing for the first time, which is quite novel, and it's going to throw up quite a few interesting issues, I think, for providers who are subject to these assessments. And also CQC has changed the way its teams operate. So it's got integrated assessment and inspection teams. Now, when you look at this, we're looking at the performance assessment side of the business that CQC is involved with. And you will no doubt recall that 10 years ago, in 2014, CQC introduced the rating system. There had been a rating system previously with the Commission for Social Care Inspection, the star ratings, but CQC came on board. They didn't have ratings to start with. That was abandoned at a certain point. I think it was around October 2010, but they were reintroduced by the sort of management team that came in 2014. And they've been around for about sort of 10 years or so with the key lines of inquiry, the rating characteristics. But really the catalyst for change was the pandemic, because CQC was forced to regulate in a different way. And they focused increasingly on using data, a data-driven way of regulating services, understandably, given the circumstances. And they moved to what they thought was really a more dynamic model of regulation, real-time regulation. which has been the sort of holy grail of regulation forever since I've been involved in the system. And in the early part of 2021, they issued their consultation document, which defined a new way of working in social regulation, social care regulation. And one of the key aspects of it would be a move to more remote assessments. So one of the things I just wanted to flag up before we start here is to what extent really that actually is going to deliver. Are they really going to deliver on those early promises around remote assessments and changing ratings, perhaps without site visits? Obviously, at the moment, all the assessments that are going on out there involve a site visit. There's been a lot of controversy at the way in which this particular system has been introduced. To put it mildly, there have been some glitches in its implementation. And not a great number of assessments have actually been undertaken so far. And actually a very small number have actually been completed to date, albeit that they actually started at the beginning of December in the South network, and then they've been rolled out across the whole country. So those are just a few observations I wanted to make, really, to sort of set the scene before other participants get involved in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. So our first topic for today is preparing for CQC assessment under the single assessment framework. So I'd like to invite Tim to kick us off, actually, alongside Charlie, with some top tips for providers.
Okay, shall I start, Charlie, and you chip
Go
in?
ahead, Tim.
Okay, so my first tip would be look at the CQC's website. Familiarize yourself with the quality statements. Familiarize yourself with the evidence types for your service type. And then know where your evidence is. Because if you don't know where your evidence is, how can you ever provide that to the CQC when they do an assessment? Because it's not called an inspection. I'd also include, you've got to share this with your staff team, because compliance is a team game, isn't it? Managers and owners, responsible individuals, can't ensure an evidence compliance on their own. Every single member of the staff team needs to understand their role and responsibility in working in a way that clearly evidences compliance with the quality statement. Because as we know, those quality statements are written at the level of good. There is no guidance about what's outstanding now. There's no guidance about what requires improvement or inadequate. It's written at the level of good. That's what you've got to provide evidence for. I won't say any more because I might steal Charlie's thunder. So I'm going to be quiet and let Charlie chip in now.
A bit like Tim, my first advice is don't panic. You know, I don't think as much has changed as you would initially think on reading these new statements. A lot of what they're looking for is in line with what they've always looked for. The onus has shifted. They're not coming to search for your information. It's being more prepared to provide them with the information. And realistically, it was never their job to come and find the information. It was always your job to present it. But there's just a greater onus on that. I think as well, you know, going through those quality statements, auditing yourself against them. And if you haven't got something that you can put into the box underneath the question, then you've got a gap. And that's where you need to focus to begin with. Then go through and look at the quality of your other answers. Getting regular feedback, you know, from your stakeholders, your staff. Don't let it be a surprise when they come. The lived experience is, you know, front and centre. We see factor accuracies returned where you've provided a lot of data to say that's wrong. And the answer is yes, but the lived experience is. And you've got to find out what that is. That sort of annual survey that you have to do needs to be much more frequent. Not so frequent that people disengage from it, though. And that's the key. Because people will see it as ticking a box, not genuinely being interested. And again, like Tim, taking those staff on that journey. In particular, you can't guarantee now that you will be on site when a CQC officer turns up. That initial contact could be to a member of your team. We're seeing a lot more inspection starting in the early hours of the morning or finishing in the late hours of the night. Somebody on site needs to be skilled in order to manage that until you can get there.
One
Really
thing that I've
interesting.
always advised providers to do is to have an inspection procedure. And I would advise providers to have an assessment procedure, just picking up on what Charlie said. And that includes who is going to be there and are they capable of dealing with the assessors, inspectors at 2 o'clock in the morning. And also they've got to have the confidence if they don't know where something is to say, I don't know where that is because that's not my remit. And also to echo what Charlie says, you've got to know how good your evidence is. And if I can illustrate that with an example. In all of the assessments I've supported clients to go through, one of the pieces of evidence that's been requested has always been the training matrix. But is your training matrix actually providing good evidence? So the example I always give, you'd expect 100% of staff to be up to date with safeguarding training. But I bet they're not, because a couple are on maternity leave, one's on long-term sick, 3 started 2 days ago. But when you send that evidence to CQC, what does it say? Oh, we're 87% compliant for safeguarding. That's terrible, but you've got a good reason for it. So put that with the evidence, qualify the evidence. And I think Charlie mentioned this, you've got to know how good your evidence, audit yourself against it. Because when you're assessed, you will be asked for a lot of information in a short space of time, an awful lot of information, like 30 or 40 bits of information. You know what's going to happen. You're going to be uploading loads of info without checking the quality. And that's going to come back. That's how you're going to be judged, isn't it? So not only know where your evidence is, but you've got to know how good it is. And Charlie mentioned self-audit yourself, or even get somebody else to come and audit you.
And just to pick up on that, Tim, on the volume of data, we've certainly seen that being an issue. And where providers have gone back and said, hey, I can't have a manager for 3 days going through this volume of data. What do you mean by all care plans? Which care plans do you actually want? What type? Can we send you a sample and send you more if you need to? And your inspection or assessment protocol can also become your tracker. What did we send?
Yeah.
Who checked before that went off?
I had a client recently that was asked for all of the staffing rotas for the last 4 weeks. They've got 140 staff. Now, the tendency, they could have sent all of the staffing rotas for 140 staff. They could have done. And I was almost tempted to get them to send it. So instead, they went back to CQC and said, you sure you want all of them? I said, oh, just send it for 6 staff. Which sort of defeats the object, doesn't it? Completely.
Absolutely. And also points to a regulator that's struggling to understand what it needs to see remotely. Because, of course, on site, you're following a theme and a trend, and you're able to sit with the inspector, to your point, Tim, and say, hey, when you read this, by the way, we use this. Cabbage is a really good example. I remember as a student nurse, some 25 years ago now, somebody going on about cabbages, and I couldn't work out what this had got to do with the patient in front of me. But it turns out in cardiology to be a coronary artery bypass and graft, which once you know makes much more sense. And if you've got something that's unique about your service, if you've got some way of dealing with a particular issue that's agreed with all the right parties through the right processes, don't just send it off and assume that they'll ask you. You need to look at it. You know what you know. You need to explain to them what you know. Let's face it, it's difficult enough when they're in the room to get them to understand some of these nuances, never mind out the room. And there is also potentially a role for legal here. If you're sending off something that is a bit more controversial, perhaps they've asked for information about an incident, you might want to get your legal team to have a look at that in order to ensure that you've sent enough narrative about where you're up to and why you couldn't be, for example, any further forward.
Really helpful, Tony. Thank you. Would you say that providers need to change their processes in light of the change from Chloe's to quality statements?
For me, I think there are some things that we need to change. As a sector, I think what we've been really good at is delivering good quality care overall to the people that are in front of us. What we didn't do was go out and employ a whole bunch of people that are interested in data mining. We didn't employ a whole load of people that are really good at GDPR queries. Just because it's the regulator doesn't mean we should send them all of this. Can we narrow that down for legitimate reasons, not to be obstructive? And what we need to change our focus to, which actually ends up delivering a better quality of care, is looking at some of our data. This time last year, we had X number of falls and we've reduced it, but that will also help us to see those peaks and troughs over a year. And I always think of Christmas time, where you've got far more visitors, people are more tired, there's more activities, there's more people in the buildings, and you'll see a little peak in falls. But if we know that's going to happen in advance, we can tweak our staffing to account for it and try and reduce that risk again. And that type of data can be gathered across a wide range of systems, a wide range of data points for the type of care that you're providing. We've even seen with a client where we've actually been able to demonstrate year on year that people have a longer life expectancy within the service, because the type of client and their needs haven't changed. But in reducing falls, increasing hydration, etc., we've been able to deliver longevity, which must be a quality marker.
If I could just pick up on Charlie's point about data, one of the evidence pieces in care homes is going to be analysis of call bell records. And in my care home clients that have been assessed under the new framework, that's always been requested. Now, I've been in services where the call bell printed out data on a dot matrix printer into a cardboard box under a printer, and there's no analysis. And I say to my care home clients, your call bell records should tell you what your average response time is to an emergency and a non-emergency call at different times of the day, at different parts of your building. It should also tell you what your longest response time was, and when it was a long response time, what did you do about that? And that's just scratching the surface of using data. Another example would be outcomes. And now there's a quality statement on monitoring and improving outcomes. But that's data, isn't it? I want to go to a service and say, of all of the types of outcome, which one are you best at meeting? And which one are you not so good at meeting? And what are you doing about the ones you're not good at meeting? And as Charlie says, that's data. You don't need to change your ways of working. Maybe we need to change the way we evidence our good practice. Like Charlie says, most of the care sector is really good at meeting people's needs. Most of the care sector is really good at giving people a good life. But most of the care sector is not really good at evidencing it.
No. And it's using the right equipment, isn't it? There was a big push for CQC asking for electronic systems to be brought in. We all know now that the NHS is supporting that in some areas. You can have certain systems with some funding and all the rest of it, but it's making sure the system makes sense and collects what you intended it to. What's its auditability, and can you use it better than somebody else that comes in? But I also use it appropriately. I remember going to a service and they've got a call bell system that also showed you where each resident was, but they'd misunderstood the purpose of the system. And these residents, I stood there waiting to see the manager thinking, my goodness me, they don't have chef around this service. Oh my goodness, that resident's gone down the stairs rather than the lift. That's brilliant. They'd given all of the trackers to staff rather than the residents. So all of the data that they've been busy gathering did not relate to the population that the system intended, and therefore didn't give them any information whatsoever about how to meet needs.
So, leading into the next question around preparing for CQC inspection, what are priority statements and how do they fit in with the assessment process?
Interestingly, on the 9th of April, CQC updated their statement on their website, and it says, and if any of you believe the July date, I'm going to begin to worry about you. But when they finished with their initial phase at the end of July 2024, they will identify the list of priority statements, which does make me question what statements the inspectors are going out to, or officers are going out to look for at this point. And there are some indicators from a variety of sources as to what some of the priority statements have been, which has been taken those that are most commonly asked at the inspections that have taken place. So around how we involve people to manage risks, around safe and effective staffing, safeguarding, independence, choice and control, and the equity and experiences. So nothing that's particularly surprising. But if they haven't yet determined what the priority statements are, but we're already using a new system, that's a bit concerning as to how, if I was a provider sitting around the table today, how am I going to meet this new process that's already in progress, and not a question of flexibility over those, and we might tweak them, but there isn't a published list that's concrete that we can all work to.
You also find that learning culture in SAFE comes up often, as does governance, management and sustainability in well-led and capable and compassionate leaders. But maybe at this point we should ask Neil and Sam, what do you think about the whole concept of CQC cherry-picking quality statements to explore? I mean, from a compliance and legal standpoint, is that a fair system?
I'm happy to give my observation on that. I mean, again, going back sort of 10 years when they sort of introduced ratings again, CQC for the first time, of course, but they sort of benchmarked the whole system. So everybody had sort of comprehensive inspections against the standards. And so there was a sort of baseline sort of across the various sectors. And it was easy to sort of move on, once they'd done that. In this particular sort of rollout, they've decided that they will only look at a small number of quality statements. There are 34 quality statements, as we know. I think environmental sustainability, that might be parked for a little while, but looking at them, they started off looking at about 5, I think, didn't they? With the good services that they started with. They decided to go easy, start easy with the good services or perceived good services. It's become sort of a bit more challenging now that they're sort of looking at services that requires improvement and inadequate. And they crept up to about 10 or 11 quality statements. But it was always going to be a minority up to that point. And it's a real problem because they're sort of relying, aren't they, then about scoring, bringing over scores from previous inspections. And that can cause all manner of issues because on the one hand, you could actually have services that perhaps ought to be rated inadequate, that aren't rated inadequate because they've carried over earlier scores that are positive. And then you can look at it the other way, that services that were inadequate previously that have improved considerably, let's say, they're not having those, carried over, but they're having the earlier very poor scorings carrying over, as it were, as ones into the new assessments. So it's really causing some sort of issues, I think, about the reliability of those assessments, particularly in terms of public assurance, I think. But equally, I'm not 100% convinced as well that the inspectors really know what they're doing at the moment in terms of going out there and assessing those services. So those are just some observations. I don't know whether, Sam, you've got anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think I'm following on from what you've just said about choosing different quality statements and drawing over old inspection findings into the new ones. I mean, we had about 3 weeks ago now, Ian Trenholm announcing in his blog that for all services who have requires improvement or inadequate ratings through the old process on any key questions, they'll look at all of the quality statements under that key question. Now, that is expected to be happening since he made that announcement, but we've seen reports that have been published by CQC on the website that haven't followed that methodology. So there's a question about whether providers should be challenging what the process has been followed for their service, when actually moving forwards, there's less of a cherry picking for those inadequate and requires improvement quality key questions. So yeah, it's concerning that they've even changed the process halfway through and it might not be applying to all providers equally. So that's another area of concern there.
I think for balance, we need to be fair to the CQC as well, though, don't we? This is a new system. It is being rolled out. There are bound to be changes. There are bound to be teething troubles. It would be really nice, wouldn't it, to do this again in 6 months' time or 9 months' time and see if our discussion is different. If any of us were rolling out a new system, we wouldn't expect it to work perfectly from day one, would we? How many of us have set out to introduce something new, and what we end up with is not what we thought we'd end up with? But CQC's the representative of society. They're there very much to be shot at, and they do get shot at. So I think, we need to give them a little bit of credit for getting this thing to fruition, to moving into the more modern age. But care providers do have the right to a fair process. And I think what we're seeing, if you look at some inspection reports published already, I don't think those care providers have been subject to a fair process. But I also think they've got a better rating than they should have had. So they probably haven't complained. And there are many examples.
Very generous mood towards the regulator too. I think
Pardon?
You're in a very generous mood towards the regulator for a care consultant.
But somebody's got to be in this room, haven't they, Charlie?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not necessarily sure I disagree.
You see, it can be.
Yeah.
Well,
and I think like many things, you get cross with the person in front of you, i.e. your local sort of CQC officer, but not necessarily at the system and feeding back. And the person that's sort of bearing the brunt of the feedback isn't going to be the one that's going and saying, hey, this isn't working for these reasons. And you're absolutely right. Having looked at some of the reports, I think that this notion that actually we're not going to be looking at the scoring at this point because we can't pull that data through. And there are people that have had a far more generous experience, as well as those that have had a far more challenging experience.
When I give you an example, there's a report on CQC's website now where it's rated as requires improvement. It's Care Home. And they've got scores of 1 for some of the quality statements, for quite a lot of quality statements. But the quality statements that weren't reviewed are scored as 3 based on what they used to be. And it's like, okay, that's ended up with a percentage score that puts them in the requires improvement category. But they've got a 1 for 4 quality statements, but 3s for the other. So they got enough points to be requires improvement. Under the old system, that would have been a slam dunk inadequate. If you just read the body of the report, and that's what I would advise all care providers to do, actually. Get yourself onto CQC's website, find services that have been assessed under the new system, have a read of their inspection reports. It seems like it's about a 2 to 3 month delay between the start of the assessment and the publication of the report. And it says for most of them that are recently published, they were assessed like beginning January, end of December. And look at what's looked at. I think it'll be very different in a few months' time.
Thanks, Tim. Could I ask, and I appreciate it's another one for Tim and Charlie, but the questions in the chat backing up sort of some of the plan around talking about the CQC inspection process itself. So quite specifically, what providers expect to happen leading up to and during an inspection. So even how and when and how they will be informed about being inspected, and when will they know what quality statements are being looked at?
Charlie, do you want to go or shall I go?
So, should I start, Tim, with how you might know and then pass to you and we'll ping pong? So in terms of how you might know that you're being inspected, either in the old traditional way, somebody turns up at the front door and says, I'm here to have a look at your service today.
At 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah. And 3, 4, we've had them starting at 11. Bizarrely, when there is no nighttime concern, the concern is about later in the day. It's very odd. Or that you receive an email telling you that they're starting some inspection activity and they need some records from you and starting from there. But the vast majority of what we're seeing and hearing is the traditional method of turning up. Whereas a lot of the anticipation is around sort of those more remote methods. We're seeing it starting on site, perhaps a shorter visit at unusual hours, but finishing with lots and lots of data requests following on from that.
I would add to that they tell the provider which quality statements are going to be examined. Most of them tend to be in safe. And then there is a list of documentation that you are requested to provide. And they give you a time scale. And the shortest I've seen is 48 hours, and the longest I've seen is a whole week. But the one where it was a week, it was 39 pieces of information that was required. And that needs to be uploaded to a location they tell you to upload it to as a drag and drop in a zip file. So you collect all of your evidence somewhere, you zip it together, and you drag and drop that into a place, and then it's done. You don't press submit or anything, it's just done, it goes. That's it, done.
Which also means you
Trying
need
to know
IT
what
skills.
evidence. Yeah. Sorry.
What's that, Charlie?
It also means that you need IT skills. You know that you need decent scanners. We've only just got decent printers in many homes.
Yeah.
You need people, the actual resource to get that data checked and
One
scanned.
thing I've come across, some of that data is often done by, especially in larger organizations, it's done by head office, isn't it? So, for example, if you want recruitment data, that may be done by an outsourced HR department. They've got to recognize that when the manager of the service says, I need this recruitment data, they need it now, not 2 weeks' time. If you don't provide, I'm not sure what happens. I don't know the answer to this one. What happens if you don't provide all of the information that was requested?
You get issued with a section, is it 61, Neil? Notice?
Well, they can issue with a section 64 letter asking for sort of information, and they can ask section 65 clarification as well about information. So, I mean, I think the issue about sort of data, I think, is really sort of key to this, isn't it? Sort of reducing people to chunks of data in many cases, which worries me. But one thing I'd like to pick up on is the assessment. It's over a period of time. So whereas before inspections were a snapshot, maybe a day or two, we're now looking at an assessment that could go on for many weeks. And the site visit could be at the beginning of that process, and it may identify some things that need to be done within the particular care service. Now, if the provider and the manager actually sort of deal with those particular issues in a timely and effective way, and they feed back that information to the regulator, then that should be relevant to scoring. It should be relevant to ratings. And indeed, the assessment handbook of CQC, the internal Bible that they're sort of giving out to their inspectors, would seem to indicate that's the case. So that really opens up an opportunity, I think, to really sort of change the narrative and actually sort of really say, look, we've been responsive, we've addressed these issues, and it really should be up to the point that the assessment actually stops, that you should be considering this data, this information, and you should be scoring us and rating us at the end of that process, really, not at the beginning of that process. So I wanted to sort of highlight that particular issue about the assessment period.
Yeah, and I know that this sort of fits in with CQC's intention behind the whole inspection, new and single assessment process, that they want to provide us up-to-date information on services as possible. So surely that would mean taking into account that information that may change throughout the assessment period.
I don't think that's going to happen in reality, because I've got a client at the moment that was visited, just turned up, request for information. 3 days later, they had a pharmacy inspection. There were things identified in the pharmacy inspection that weren't quite right. But the assessment has not yet concluded because they haven't had a draft report. All of those things from the pharmacy inspection have now been fixed. Evidence has been sent to CQC. So are we saying they should be scored for meds optimization based upon what they've now fixed, even though the non-compliance was pointed out by the pharmacy inspector?
And that we have to bear in mind that a tribunal's already ruled on this point in relation to a service where there was abuse. CQC were aware of that abuse so they weren't aware when they were on site, but they were aware by the time the final report was drafted.
Okay.
And an independent report found that they ought to have included those changes in the report, because people would have potentially not placed had they have been aware of the abuse.
So we're extrapolating that. So if there's positive information, the positive information should be taken into account. But under the old system, that would have been referred to in the body of the report. We found these non-compliances and the provider addressed these at the time. But now it's got numbers attached to it, hasn't it?
Well, that's a good point, Tim, about the numbers, because so far there's been a lot of talk about the quality statements and the scoring of the quality statements, but of course you derive those scores, don't you, from the evidence category scores at the bottom. And I'm not sure that CQC at the moment is actually sort of giving out those draft evidence category scores to providers when they send out the draft assessment reports. And ultimately, CQC said that they would be publishing those evidence category scores as well. But of course, as a lawyer, what I would want to see is actually the evidence itself. What evidence, indicators, what quality indicators have been looked at, what the evidence actually is. And then you can look at it and say, well, actually, does that justify a 1 rather than a 2? So there can be a lot of sort of arguments, I think, about getting that information from CQC, because it's not an open and transparent organisation by nature. But then if you do get that information, that you interrogate it and you actually sort of push back, because some of these judgments are going to be quite arbitrary, quite subjective, I think. An assessor and an inspector sitting down in a room working through 20 or 30 or 40 judgments about scores for evidence categories.
But what if in an evidence category, processes is the one with all the documents in, isn't it? What if you've got 7 different types of document to review? You've got to judge that evidence based on the collective, but some of it could be really good and some of it could be really poor. So, Neil, I think, and Sam, I think you're going to have a field day with providers.
Well, I mean, it remains to be seen, doesn't it? But I mean, I think there are teething problems, I think, in all of this. It depends on how they sort of they really implement it. And it will change over time. I mean, I've mentioned about the assessment period, because that could be interesting in terms of what they need to take into account in terms of scoring. But the other aspect is that, let's suppose you get to the end of the assessment period and there are still some things that you need to do to put right. CQC will then send you the draft assessment report. There'll be a factual accuracy process. We'll pick up on some of those issues perhaps a little bit later in this seminar. But once you get the final report through, they could ask you for an action plan and say, OK, we want you to sort of deal with our particular concerns under Regulation 12, safe care and treatment, for example. And then you put your action plan in provider and says, OK, we can do all of this within 4 weeks. So you send that action plan in. After 4 weeks, you contact CQC with a whole bunch of evidence. We've done it. We've actually sort of achieved that sort of outcome. According to CQC's handbook, what they should then be doing is carrying out a responsive assessment, which is another assessment process. So they should look at all of that evidence. They should revisit the evidence categories, and that can lead to changes of scoring at evidence category level. And what we know is these things are so finely balanced between these sort of percentages that just getting a few changes on 1 or 2 quality statements could make a huge difference to what the ultimate rating is for that particular key question, and then overall for the whole service. So there's a real opportunity then, I think, after the inspection to influence that narrative if they actually do carry out these reflective assessments after inspection, where they actually impose requirements, as it were. The big issue for me is whether CQC is actually resourced to do all of this. Do they actually have enough people to do all of this in a meaningful, thorough way, where they really do analyse evidence, they've got the time to do it, and reach views, judgments that are actually sustainable, defensible?
And just to add to that, in response as well, in part to a question that's been posed, where you do then get your rating under this new, more dynamic system, much like now, you then write to CQC with some evidence of the improvement and start challenging that actually we do need our rating looked at. We've certainly come across, and from some of the solicitors we work with had feedback that they now have come across where cases where CQC have come out on commercial grounds to reevaluate the service. And that's something that we didn't see. It was always automatically turned down, certainly pre-pandemic, but it is certainly been 5 or 6 cases this year alone that I come across where that has been successful. But it is making sure that you're ready, because if you come out, if they come out because you've asked them to reassess your service, you really can get into some difficulty if you're then wrong, because not only do you have issues, but you thought that you didn't. So you can really struggle with well led. So it's a dangerous game if you're not ready, but a really good one if you are. And harnessing the power of the people that live in your services or use your services and their families. If the rating doesn't reflect what they see, we go back to the lived experience and make a request for a re-evaluation.
Great, thank you. Sorry, just sort of leading into the next question around challenging CQC, because there are quite a lot of questions in the chat around that exact topic, Charlie, of the fluidity of being able to challenge and move ratings more easily than previously. Are there any other processes available for providers to challenge CQC? I guess that's one maybe for Sam.
Yeah, so I'll take this one. Well, CQC has some formal processes for challenging them. So they've got their factual accuracy process, rating reviews, there's a complaints process, and obviously if CQC take enforcement action, there's statutory rights to challenge that as well. So there are a few formal processes. I mean, as we've just been talking about now, looking at the current concerns that people have been raising about the single assessment framework, including uncertainties around implementation, and also looking at the clear staff dissatisfaction displayed to the CQC's recent staff survey, it's clear that CQC are under a lot of scrutiny at the moment and are much more vulnerable to challenge, and so potentially more likely to respond to that challenge. And we've, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen one example of that already with Ian Trennan's blog and the change to looking at all quality statements under key questions rated as requires improvement or inadequate. Now, Charlie and Tim have already pointed to ways of being able to challenge CQC through the inspection process in terms of providing the evidence that you think is relevant to those quality statements and evidence categories, and just ensuring that you're giving as much information as you can, putting that forward. Now, if then you get a draft inspection report that you don't think properly reflects the information that you discuss and that you believe CQC saw and you provided during the inspection, then you have that factual accuracy process to challenge. Factual accuracy is very similar as to before the single assessment framework. You still have 10 working days to respond from the date that you receive the draft report. We no longer have factual accuracy tables. Instead, now you get sent a link to your draft assessment report, and you have the opportunity to submit factual accuracy comments to that assessment report online, and you can supply additional evidence to support that as well. Neil mentioned earlier about the assessment handbook noting that information you provide must relate to the time of the assessment, but obviously we have that whole assessment period now, so arguably you can provide information up to the date that you received your final feedback form at the end of your inspection, say that that's the last day, so you must take into account these things in order to challenge any statements that you don't agree with in the report, and we'll see how that pans out, but that's a potential area for challenge through that process. They still say that information about improvements made after an assessment could be mentioned in the report, but won't be taken into account with the scoring. But again, it's a question of whether things that happen during the assessment period will fall under the score, will be included under the scoring system or not. The rating review process still exists. They've actually changed it now. On the website, it refers to it as a rating process review, so that's slightly different, but really you still have those 15 working days to submit a rating review. There's a limit of 500 words. Potentially, given the current changes to the single assessment framework and uncertainties around how that works, potentially providers might be able to get more traction with the rating review process at this point, because previously under the old system I'd have said rating reviews aren't that useful. I've had a couple of successful ones in the past, but then they narrowed their parameters and it's been really difficult to get any kind of engagement through that process in recent years. But potentially that's another area that's open for challenge and might be more easily pursued under this new process. And another area is obviously raising complaints with CQC. I think CQC's website says that you have the with the individual you're dealing with at CQC or with their National Customer Services Centre. One of the issues with the complaints process that we've noticed, and that they do say in their on their policy, is that complaints will be paused if CQC is taking enforcement action against a care provider. So they might not be able to consider that complaint until after the enforcement action has concluded. And we've had, in the past, I've had a lot of backwards and forwards with CQC about how that's potentially unfair, but that is another process for challenging. Neil, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I think that's a very good summary, Sam. I mean, just a couple of things I'd add to that. Obviously, complaints, they go into CQC. CQC don't tend to be particularly sort of responsive in their sort of handling of complaints. They tend to sort of aim to sort of indicate, what the sort of inspectors have sort of said sort of during an inspection. We've had a couple of cases where we've taken it up to the Ombudsman. We've got a couple of cases on there at the moment, and that's going to be very interesting. Those reports are going to, well, certainly one report is going to be published pretty soon. That was a case in point, actually. So we've gone all the way to the Ombudsman, and we're looking forward to seeing what the Ombudsman will say about CQC in that instance. But that was one, there was a very poor inspection where we challenged successfully. We got quite a few changes made, not all the changes that we wanted. So we got a barrister on board. We got a pre-action protocol letter drafted threatening judicial review. And CQC backed down ultimately and withdrew that particular report. They didn't publish it in the end. I wrote to them and said, have you notified your insurer? And the insurer is NHS Resolution. And we got into a discussion, if I can put it in mild terms, and we ultimately got the legal cost. 75% of the legal cost of that provider was sort of repaid by NHS Resolution on behalf of CQC. So we got a good outcome there. I say we're taking it to the Ombudsman. We're sort of we're not giving up on that one. There's a second one as well that's in the pipeline. The Ombudsman wouldn't actually look at it. First of all, they said no. There's a cosy sort of set of correspondence with CQC. We put a pre-action protocol letter into the Ombudsman. The Ombudsman are now saying no, we're going to look at it. We're terribly sorry, we got it wrong. So we're sort of taking that forward. So there's the opportunity, I think, really to sort of look at Ombudsman, look at judicial review. It doesn't always have to go all the way to judicial review, obviously. Very often a pre-action protocol letter will actually sort of make the difference, will actually force that change. And if you send a pre-action protocol letter to the chief executive at CQC, they tend to respond pretty quickly, in my experience.
That's really helpful, Neil. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat now, and a lot of those are around. Sorry, they're just jumping down to the most popular ones. They shift about for some reason. I don't quite know why. Open questions. There's a particularly interesting one around the Ofsted have changed how they approach the timescales around giving feedback in light of events, and will with the very sad case where the headmistress died from suicide. Do you think that CQC will appreciate the pressure that they are putting care providers under, and go along the same lines in terms of being more flexible and giving more time to providers?
I think the answer is no. Given the February board minutes included a statement along the lines of CQC believe that the manager is not the person that sort of carries the label of the rating. I think that indicates where they're heading with this, and certainly in a recent experience, I've had to draw to the CQC officers' attention the fact that the manager was now in tears and had left the office twice to compose herself, but the inspection continued regardless. We've raised the level of pressure that the manager was feeling as a result of the inspection with the line manager offsite, and the answer was the inspection's going ahead. We've got concerns, and absolutely, we'd all agree that unlike a school, obviously in a school, if you were to find a significant safeguarding, of course that has a direct impact. But we accept that in care settings, you're often wholly dependent upon those people that are providing care to you, and the risks are probably higher than in a school setting, but not, say, for example, in a nursery setting. But I don't agree that it's the manager doesn't feel the same pressure a head teacher would. After all, a head teacher doesn't carry all of the work in the school. They lead it and they oversee it, and a manager does exactly the same. And often, a head teacher goes home, isn't going to be at risk of a call in the middle of the night to say that there's an emergency and you need to come in. The managers are often on call 24 hours a day. They're certainly responsible for that service 24 hours a day. And I think there's a huge amount of pressure and quite a public downfall from grace if your rating isn't what you'd hoped. And unlike in many other workplaces, you have very little control over it. You can't go and redecorate a lounge that needs decoration if the money isn't there to do it. You can't get the piece of equipment for the person that's sitting in their home unable to be hoisted because the NHS won't supply the hoist. So a lot is out of your control, but you're publicly accountable for
it. Next question. We had from anonymous attendee. We had an inspection under the new inspection regime 2 months ago. We've yet to receive the report back from CQC. Given the move away from a one-off static threshold visit and a commitment to judging the quality of care on an ongoing basis, would the length of time it has taken to publish the report be grounds to challenge it? We may not wish to challenge it, of course, exclamation mark.
As far as I'm aware, there is no timescale now to present the draft report. Under a previous system, it used to be 50 working days, if I remember, a long time ago. But if you look at CQC's website, you see now inspection reports being published now that were 2-3 months ago. It seems to be about a 2 to 3 month from the start of the assessment. Whether that's grounds for challenge it, personally, I doubt it. But then I'm not a specialist lawyer, and we've got 2 of those here with us. They can answer that.
I was going to say, would Neil
We'll
might just jump in on that one? They're both on mute at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's a difficult one, really. I mean, certainly, sort of in previous guidance, I've seen that CQC had they did raise that spectre that if there was too long a delay, that there could be sort of challenges really to the relevance of the inspection report. So I think it is a sort of consideration that one can sort of look into, I think. I mean, the other thing is that sometimes you have delayed enforcement action taken. So sometimes you may have a warning notice, for example, that could be based on an inspection that may have happened, sort of a month or so before, and then there's a sort of dialogue by way of written representations about whether or not they should be publishing information, as it were, about a warning notice. And one of the things you can present there is to say, well, in actual fact, it was a while ago since you came back in and inspected. It could also be a notice, a proposal to cancel, well, other sort of types of documents that could be flagged up. And we could say that, well, actually, no, things have actually changed on the ground. Again, this point that things have actually sort of moved on. And it wouldn't be reasonable for them to say, let's present sort of information about a warning notice. So that's, I think, where it could be relevant to the issue of publication of information relating to a warning notice. But I've never actually seen it done in practice. But if there was a monumental delay, if it went on for 6 months or 8 months, you'd be thinking, well, actually, really, CQC ought to be coming in and sort of reassessing the service. And at the very least, there ought to be an opportunity to sort of have the second report published as a matter of priority, particularly if there's been any improvement, sort of since the last inspection. So those are just a few considerations there, I think, on my part.
Under the previous system, though, there were often reports published 6 to 9 months after the date of the inspection, usually when there's been prolonged enforcement action or challenge. Under the previous system, that was a reasonably common occurrence, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we obviously get into debates with the regulator about individual inspection reports and whether, in fact, they should actually be issued at all, whether they should be published at all. Because if they are demonstrably wrong or misleading, to use the terminology of a High Court case, if you can show that's the case, then they shouldn't be publishing that, or they should certainly be making the necessary corrections. But we do come across situations where inspection reports are fundamentally flawed. They are sort of riddled with error. And we have to sort of go and challenge those. Most of the time, we can obviously try and sort of move it forward with some degree of, I suppose, haste, and also get the changes made to reports and get them published, obviously, because it's in the public interest as well, obviously, to see those reports. It's important.
But that's what the factual accuracy response is for, isn't it? And you see your CQC reports published with clear errors including typos, and you think, well, has the provider not read it? Challenged it?
I think that's the trouble though, Tim, particularly around typographical errors. I don't think providers see that as their job, but actually it affects how your report reads, and people don't always understand the correlation of how that report came together. But certainly under this new regime, I've seen some really interesting factual accuracy challenges. And whilst it's always been a case that people often say, well, I say this happened versus your version, without sending any further evidence, under this new regime, what we've seen is, as an example, my call bell took a long time to answer, and the provider sends all the call bell logs and the analysis thereof. And the answer that CQC send doesn't really give any assurance that they've actually looked at the data with fresh eyes. And it will say something like the lived experience is at the centre of everything that we do with our new inspection regime, and that's the report, that's the experience reported. And actually, we often deal with mental health settings where people may have altered perception of reality. We deal with people with dementia, or lots of other reasons that people's perception of what's happening may not be accurate, which is all the more reason why we need to be able to evidence the care that we're giving. But also means that there shouldn't be a blanket statement just because somebody says that that's their experience.
Thank you, Charlie. That's really helpful. We're coming to the end of our time together. Neil, would you like to say a few words before we start?
Well, obviously, first of all, just to thank all the participants today. It's been a sort of great discussion, a lively discussion. We're sort of on a journey here, really, with CQC. We'll just have to see where it goes over the next few months as it beds down. I mean, we know that a large corporate provider has sort of indicated that they have been minded to sort of, threaten a challenge to the way CQC has started the implementation of this single assessment process. So, we could be seeing sort of legal challenges over the course of the next 6 months or a year. We'll just have to see what happens. I suppose the final concern that I've got with all of this, I think, is this failure to sort of start to benchmark really at the very beginning all of these services against the single assessment framework. And I think this is going to continue to be a problem over time, because CQC is saying, I think, that even in the future, they may only look at a minority of quality statements moving forward. And indeed, even under quality statements, they may not look at all the evidence categories, under those quality statements. And so there's going to be a lot of inconsistency, a lot of old information is going to be carried over, and if that is the case, I think there's a real problem here with this system, to be quite honest. And it seems to me that it wouldn't be fit for purpose if that were to continue to be the case. And the way that I think it could be resolved is if they get rid of ratings. Now, that might seem a radical thing to say as a final statement, but certainly Ofsted has come under a lot of pressure, obviously on the back of the Ruth Perry case, about ratings, basically dumbing something down to a rating of inadequate on the basis of a few, sort of relatively minor safeguarding sort of issues in that particular setting that we're talking about. And I know that the Labour Party, I think, are sort of looking in terms of Ofsted at whether or not those single sort of word sort of ratings are going to continue. And if they're going to say that for CQC, they can equally say it for Ofsted, they can equally say it for CQC. So what you could have instead would be a sort of narrative, going back to the old days when compliance actually was, the top of the tree, really. That was at the front of the report. So I could see a situation coming further down the line where maybe ratings would go and basically narrative would sort of take over. And that's the way that they do it, because they say, we've gone in, we've looked at 5 quality statements, and this is the narrative about that particular sort of set of issues. That's just a sort of final comment on my part.
Thank you, Neil. And a big thank you to all of our panellists today. And thank you to everyone who has attended. We hope that you have found it useful. And if you don't already, you can follow any of our panellists on LinkedIn. And if you have any further questions you didn't get a chance to ask in the chat, then you can contact the Government Partnership on sols@gordonsouls.co.uk. And I wish all of you a really good rest of the day. Thank you.